So thank you very much. I just want to make sure that you can all see the presentation, which we are uploading at this time. So please let me know if that's fine.
Yes,
I assume
everything is fine.
that's perfect. Okay, that's great. So thank you very much. And I think I'll start right away. I've been allocated 45 minutes for presentation, but I would like to be briefer because there may be questions. If there aren't, I can add some color to the story I'm going to tell you. But I will try to be briefer than 45 minutes so that, this is, of course, difficult when we don't see each other. So I'll try my best to be brief. So I've been asked to talk about the impact of the coronavirus on China and the rest of Asia. Of course, nobody really knows what the economic impact will ultimately be, not only because we don't know how long the coronavirus is going to last in terms of actual outbreak and control of the outbreak, but most importantly, we don't really know yet how big of a response in terms of policy measures the Chinese government will actually take. So there's two big uncertainties to really talk about what's going to happen in economic terms. But I can already give you a sense of where we see the Chinese economy going with these big uncertainties, no doubt. And most importantly, for many of you operating in Asia, what could be the impact on Asia, and in particular, the Asian value chain. So what kind of changes are we expecting in terms of how companies may operate in China for its manufacturing down the road, given the size of the shock? As you see, basically what I'm going to do, impact of coronavirus in China, global value chain number 2, and then a few sectors that are especially hit. So hospitality, aviation, and the auto sector. So in terms of impact on China, I think that the first thing I need to tell you is that this is not SARS for 2 reasons. First, size. China is much bigger than it was during SARS, so it has a much bigger global impact. Second, China is indeed much more of a tourism and aviation center. This brings me to the sectors I want to cover later. So the impact on some sectors is obviously bigger than it would have been during SARS. The other very important difference is that China, at the time of SARS, was in a way in a positive mood because it had just entered the WTO only a couple of years before, and the whole idea was China would grow faster, and it's entering the global value chain. And now China has been in a structural deceleration for years, since 2012, and on top of that, it's gone through very difficult years. 2015, it's, I may say, self-inflicted event related to stock market crash, renminbi devaluation. Then you had the Trump's arrival, 2018-19 trade war, and now the coronavirus. So China's potential growth has come down from 10 to barely, well, last data was 6.1, but I would argue that potential growth is even lower than that. So it's a totally different situation. And I think only by focusing on this, we can kind of understand how big this shock is for the global economy. We shouldn't compare with SARS. That's the first thing, although I will in some instances in terms of showing you some figures. But this is a much bigger shock, first thing I would like to say, for the reasons I mentioned. So if, again, because we have nothing better, we take SARS as an example, the other thing we should realize is that not only is China bigger for the world, obviously, and for some specific sectors, tourism, aviation, etc., as I mentioned, but more generally, the shock is bigger for China itself, let alone China's bigger size for the world, because the service sector, which is generally more affected, or at least was more affected during SARS, is so much bigger today than it was in 2003. So the actual structure of the Chinese economy makes this shock bigger, not for the world only, which I've explained, but for China. Now, let alone the very large impact on the service industry. And we could argue maybe not so much for online services, yes, but online services continue to be only a relatively small share of total services. So overall, it is a shock for services. I just want to clarify that because I get that question many times. But even for manufacturing, this shock is bigger than SARS in as far as, and I don't have SARS on page 6, but because this big data wasn't available, but it is because there's been more disruption in production than there was during SARS. So again, just look at that data point, which is measure of sentiment on manufacturing, and you will see that it is indeed collapsing. There's been a recent survey by the American Chamber and a couple of surveys also in China showing that between 70% to only 50% of the manufacturing industry is currently working. So that's a very, very big shock for the manufacturing sector. So now I get to the point of response. Okay, so the shock is big. We would expect 100 basis points less growth in China. We're still finalizing this new report on the impact on the first quarter, but from 6.1 growth in the first quarter, you could imagine that we could go down to say 4. So it's a big shock for the first quarter, but we don't hold the view at Natixis that big shock in the first quarter will immediately reflect in the final, so 2020 GDP figure for China. And the reason is the response. The response, we argue, is going to be very large. If you ask me, should China do that? That's a different question, okay? One could argue that China is already very leveraged, that it doesn't have the full room to do this. Well, whatever I think about it is irrelevant, because I think because of the importance of the growth target in 2020, remember the nation's rejuvenation, doubling the income in 10 years, the year is 2020, end of the 5-year plan. I mean, the 100th anniversary of the party in 2021. There's so many reasons to basically understand that the 2020 growth target, GDP growth target for China is essential for the leadership. And therefore, I think policies are going to be extremely lax in China this year. And they've already cut, in fact, the 1-year policy rate, the MLF. We expect the lending rate, the private lending rate also. And you can see that this is happening. Even inflation on page 7 is growing up. I mean, it's going up even further, going past 5%. Of course, not core inflation, as we call it, we economists, meaning inflation when you take out oil and you take out food prices. That is still controlled. But people do pay for food prices for food today, and therefore, in terms of disposable income, China is feeling the pinch. Chinese households are feeling the pinch of high inflation today. But the PBOC is not going to bother because the main objective is growth. And that's going to be basically my argument why we see lax policies and therefore higher growth than you would imagine at the end of the year, all the way, in our opinion, to 5.5%, which barely make it to the target of doubling GDP income in 10 years. Now, one thing that you should all be concerned about is, I mean to say, more than just cutting interest rates. I mean to say that local governments will be allowed to issue more debt. It's already been announced that they can load their bond issuance. But, and this is very important for you all, in my opinion, the renminbi is another obvious policy measure. So we do expect the renminbi to go beyond 7. So we are barely there. It did go past 7, a couple of instances, but we think it's going to go beyond 7. Of course, the key to answer this question comes from the U.S. negotiators, whether they will be more flexible in terms of what they have agreed with China on phase 1 deal. Our call is yes, they will, because nobody, including the U.S., no matter the mantra or the language used, nobody wants to see a very weak China in the run-up to the presidential elections. You may want to see a weak China, or a China that kind of abides to the U.S. rules, but you don't want to see a too weak China that could unravel a global recession, say. And I think this is, of course, something that will be taken into consideration when seeing the renminbi fly again, slowly but steadily, beyond 7. And we're of course, very close to that already. So that's on page 9. You have the details of our projection. Basically, what we would be saying is that without the stimulus, we would be below 5, but because of the stimulus, we'll be at 5.5. And we were expecting, just that the 2 sessions have been delayed, the government was slightly below 6. That was the last announcement by Li Keqiang, something between 5.5 and 6, and reaching 5.5 being a success given the coronavirus. So that was our call, but unfortunately the 2 sessions have been delayed because of the current circumstances. So I move quickly to China's larger relevance in terms of global value chains. So there's a lot being said about why, say, Apple announced, profit warning yesterday, and finally, in my opinion, the stock market reacted to this. I say finally because I think they should have reacted so much earlier. There were many other companies warning, just maybe they weren't as sexy, quote unquote, as Apple. But we had Hyundai, we have Toyota, many saying we're suffering shortages in inputs to our production because of the coronavirus in China. So finally, the stock market yesterday got the message, but again, it's slightly belated in terms of the actual reality. Why is China so central in this discussion of global value chains? Because it's by now the largest exporter. We know that. I mean, obviously, country-wise, Europe is as a whole, but not in terms of nation. China is not only the largest exporter, we all know that. It actually has 29% of global manufacturing, so it's humongous. But that is not so relevant for the global value chain. What is relevant is that China is the larger exporter of intermediate goods for other countries to re-export. This is basically the official definition, OECD, others, of the value chain. So it's all about intermediate goods. This is why Apple is issuing a profit warning. It's Apple's intermediate goods, inputs to production that China can't deliver. So the focus should be on intermediate goods that are the basis for somebody else to produce and then perhaps re-export. So for that in particular, China is the largest exporter in the world. We've heard about medicines in Europe, ministers of health in Europe scrambling to meet, and, rather than focusing on how to prevent coronavirus in Europe, which of course is important, they were talking about the supply of pharmaceutical or drugs, which is like, wait a minute, we thought drugs were produced in Europe. Now they're produced in China as well. In fact, ibuprofen, as an example, 90%, I heard from a journalist, I guess it must be from the Wall Street Journal, I remember, telling me 90% of ibuprofen is produced in China. So when you have such supply concentration or a concentration of the global supply chain in China, you would expect a massive impact from the coronavirus, okay? So everything I said is page 11. You can see, the share of China in exports of, I did give a figure which is 29. That is China's share in the production of total manufacturing, because a lot of that remains in China. The figures you have on page 11 is the China's share in the export of manufacturing goods. Low, because, lower, obviously, because a lot of the previous year remains in China. The other one is China's share, so the export of intermediates used by other countries to re-export. So this is really the measure of China's role in the value chain, as I mentioned, which has been increasing, although, and this is extremely important, the value chain globally has been shrinking. So China has been increasing its share in something that is shrinking, which gives you a sense of how dependent China, and I think everybody realizing, maybe a bit late in the game, but finally realizing. I will start you from page 12, because I did say I would finish early. So page 14 until I can go back during the Q&A. This gives you a sense of China's export market share for some products. So for example, for semiconductors, the last product, China's market share is very small, 15%. But for others, like lighting fixtures and fitting, 60% on average. Some products could be even higher. Textile, 45%. So there you have a sense of where we could face supply chain disruptions. Moving to the sectors, I'm going to focus on, of course, I'll try my best to take other questions on sectors that we've not yet analyzed, but this is what we've analyzed in more detail. Also because they are obviously harder hit, hospitality and aviation, and to a lesser extent, the auto industry. So on hospitality, what you have there is the impact of, again, SARS. So of course, the most obvious fall, or the sharpest fall, was in foreign tourism. As you can imagine, foreign tourism is today very, very important for China, and therefore this bigger fall, which may or may not happen today, for foreign tourism is, of course, very important for countries which are very dependent on Chinese tourism, Thailand being the most obvious example. So there you have the tourism arrival in other geographies close to China or part of China by that token, such as Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, and Singapore. So you see that the recovery was pretty fast, but the fall was year on year. You know, for a place like Singapore or Taiwan, the fall was 80%. You also have the hotel occupancy ratio on the right-hand side of page 17, where you had falls of 66% in a year in Hong Kong. So what we're seeing today is not new. What's the difference? Hong Kong is more dependent on tourism. So the same fall in the occupancy ratio means more for Hong Kong than it did mean in streets. And the same is true from Taiwan and Singapore. Frankly speaking, Taiwan less so. So not only the fall is more limited than Hong Kong, but the importance of tourism is also has not grown as much as for the rest. So I think Taiwan, in a way, is more shielded than Hong Kong, Macau, or Singapore. So there you have the tourism arrival and you can see the difference, going back to the point of how much more important the shock is. So for Hong Kong, the the number of people who arrived in 2019 was over 40 million, and it was only the different size in the shock. This is from mainland China only, by the way, which is the crux of the issue here. Although, quite frankly, Hong Kong is obviously seeing a sharp reduction in arrivals from the rest of the world as well, because we're supposed to be part of the coronavirus story. and the borders are not fully closed. So, for a number of reasons, it's not that it's only affecting mainland Chinese tourism, although there and now is obviously 100%, given the sharp or the strict kind rules that the Hong Kong government has imposed. The other very important issue is that Asia has become much more important for the top 5 global hotel groups, as you see. So not only is the fall in the number of arrivals very, very important, and China's been more important for all of these countries I was mentioning here, but also for global hotel groups, Asia is a much bigger part of the pie than it was before. So this brings me to new profit warnings, apples, hotel groups globally. So this is a global event. It's not only a China-centric event. Global value chains is one reason. The hospitality sector is second. And I'm going to move to the most obvious one. So very fast on the aviation. Here you go. So basically for aviation, there's 2 big events. One is SARS to compare with, and the other one is the global financial crisis in 2008. And then I want to offer you some lessons out of these 2 events for today's coronavirus story. So the first thing is that we need to focus passenger aviation and freight. And interestingly, the crisis in 2008 was a freight type, mostly a freight type crisis because trade collapsed, while the SARS was more of a passenger type crisis because that's what collapsed, as you can see in the graph on page 19. And in some places more than others, Taiwan was severely affected, followed by China and Hong Kong, less so Singapore and Japan. That was 2003, as you can see. Today, I think we're going to see both passenger, mostly, and even more intensely, but also freight, because we have supply chain. So this is why it's very likely that today's event than either of the 2 I have mentioned. I'm trying to speed up a little bit, sorry. The only good news is that the Asian carriers are quite ready to cushion the impact of the coronavirus because their ability to pay especially Japan, Singapore, also Taiwan, India affected, and Thailand and Philippines follow at the bottom of my table on page 21. So what I'm trying to say is that I guess if you want to think of defaults, or we have the story of Cathay in Hong Kong, obviously, or Hong Kong Airlines, I think you need to focus on budget companies, which actually may be merged or taken over. The reason being that the structural demand is in so about domino effect of defaults on airline companies because of coronavirus. Because I would argue it's more of a liquidity problem. Seeing what happened in 2008 and 2003. But again, it's a sector that will drag down on global growth, very obviously. On cars, and we've already published a report, we'll publish one more today on the demand, because, as you know, Hubei is an important center for car production, 9% of total, it's less than 5% of China's GDP. So, people say, wow, a lot of production is not going to happen, rightly so. But our point, and it's very, very important, is to really remember that China is in overcapacity in terms of auto production. So, yes, it will affect the value chain of Hyundai, maybe, I can't remember if it was Toyota or Honda doing this profit warning. But what I'm trying to say is that, yes, Others will suffer because they depend on China parts. But in terms of China-based manufacturers, there's a long way to go, because even if Chile announced, I think, minus 29% reduction in sales, well, the reality is that they weren't selling before, and therefore I'm sure they have huge spare capacity to sell. So the key problem really is that China is 30% of global auto sales, from barely 4% during SARS. So, it's a huge market. And what is happening is that I'm moving quite quickly, so the utilization rate, as you see, is coming down to 78%, page 23. I'm just trying to show you that there's huge overcapacity. I'm going to move directly to the last page, 25, to show you that car sales have been coming down in China since 2000, on negative territory actually, since 2018. 19 was also terrible. So 2020 is going to be even more so, obviously, because of the coronavirus. So no cars are being sold. Remember the minus 29% announced by Geely. So the idea that there is supply chain constraints is not very relevant for China itself. It's going to be relevant for some companies, especially elsewhere, depending on China. But the problem in China will be that retail sales, for which autos account for, I think, 25%, so it's a huge part of retail sales, will be very weak because no autos are going to be sold. And this brings me back to literally China's growth story. So the stimulus will have to be very large, maybe even with all kinds of vouchers and discounts and subsidies for automakers to be able to sell those cars at a much cheaper price so that they're bought, rather than supply chain constraints only. And this brings me to the idea that although people are writing about global inflation because of the coronavirus, I actually think it's more of a deflationary shock. We see inflation now because it's a short-term impact, but as long as demand remains stagnant, that's going to be more of a deflationary shock. So in conclusion, the coronavirus outbreak is yet one more negative shock. Let's not forget, for the Chinese economy. Yet one more. We have had many others, let alone China's own structural deceleration because of aging, the end of urbanization, and blah, blah, blah. So, we have to put this into context. This is why this is certainly not SARS. It's in a way the nail on the coffin, if I may say, of the Chinese economy down the road. I'm not saying that China won't be there. China will be there. It will be the largest economy in the world, no doubt, in terms of GDP size. But in terms of soft power, like China's clout, in terms of China Inc., all of what that meant to many of us, I think all of that is going to be much weaker down the road. The stimulus package will come, then which will further in terms of its financials. Both China and the rest of Asia will show very bleak growth first quarter. Get ready for a very bad first quarter. But we expect the stimulus to kick in and have better figures down by the end of the year. On a sector basis, the hardest sectors, hospitality and airlines, are reserves. I think to be very targeted to the industries most affected by coronavirus, and therefore we don't expect a domino effect of defaults in China or elsewhere. For the auto sector, the biggest problem lies on the lack of demand. So yes, there's supply constraints, but that's not really an aggregate effect. There may be for several companies, for several specific parts, the problem really lies on the lack of demand. And finally, and very important for anybody working in terms of the supply chain, the China-centric global supply chain is being reshuffled. It's not about the coronavirus only. This started because of high wages in China. It continued or it accelerated because of the trade war. And again, the coronavirus is the nail on the coffin of China's central role in the global value chain. So many clients we are talking to tell us that they had already started diversifying away from China, and the only thing they're going to do is to continue doing that much faster. So I leave it there. That's my final word. I hope I can now move this to the queries. Sorry,
thank you, Alicia. So,
yes.
yeah,
Yes.
just a word maybe to organize the Q&A. As we are a lot this morning, maybe if you have any question, you can use the group chat just to organize, let's say, the speech of everyone. So if you have any question, you can type your question, and then it will make it easier, I think.
Anyone
wants to ask a question?
Can we have the presentation? Alicia, are you still here?
Yes, the presentation is on.
Yeah.
Yes, the presentation is on. The question is.
It can be, of course, it can be distributed. No
Thank questions. You so much.
Thank you. Problem.
Okay. You said that maybe you can share views of on other sectors. Do you have already some inputs for other ones?
No, we've only done research on these three sectors. Okay. But of course, if there are questions, I mean, based on my readings, I can try to answer them to the best of my knowledge.
Okay. Any question from the audience? Yes. So one. Yes. So the impact on Europe economy and retail and fashion.
Yes. Well, we are now working at Natixis on the impact on Europe. So the most obvious sector again is the auto industry in Germany, which we are working on, which is of course already severely weak and in a restructuring mode. So this is going to be an additional shock for the German economy. That's kind of the direct impact, both chemical, autos. Remember that these sectors were already affected by the phase one deal because we were expecting a lot of trade diversion away from Europe, exports from Europe into China towards the US, because of the 200 billion that China has committed to purchase in terms of different well, of course, energy as well, but manufacturing only is 80 billion. So that's going to affect Europe negatively as well. So this is one more shock on top of that one. And beyond that, there is some, interestingly, sorry, just 1 second. I'm not sure whether you can see me, so they will help me now move out of the presentation to see the screen.
Yeah, we see the presentation.
Yes. Sorry, and maybe now you can see me.
Not yet.
Let me see. Yeah, on. Yeah. Okay, that's great. Okay. Yes. Okay, that's great. So yes, that's perfect. Thank you so much. So what I was saying is that now Europe is going to be affected directly, negatively. Supply chain issues. Sentiment, of course, sentiment has worsened globally, but there is one positive impact that I have to mention, and this is commodity prices. So Europe is obviously a large importer of oil and other commodities, and commodity prices are plummeting because of China. So that's the positive. Overall, I think the impact is negative globally, but it very much depends on how long this shock lasts, obviously. This is the impact on Europe. There was a second question, which...
yes, the question from Caroline, for example, and I think that the question of Marie-Hélène is also linked about retail and fashion, and let's say all luxury goods.
Well, I'm sorry to say that every single non-durable good, and especially basically non-necessity type of good, will suffer a huge shock in the first quarter in China. Why? Because that's not something you may buy online, but you might not be in the mood to buy online, if you see what I mean. So what we see on auto sales, which is plummeting, is 50% on average reduction in auto sales, could well reflect what may happen for the luxury industry in terms of sales in China. I'm sorry to say. How long this will last is uncertain, but I think it's not very different from what we see. I don't think it will be very different from what we see in the auto industry. Maybe less so, but maybe not as extreme, because it's obviously less in terms of the actual amount spent for the purchase. But I do think it's an important shock for the luxury industry. And on top of that, we're already seeing on the pharmaceutical industry a lot of push from the Chinese government to substitute foreign drugs by China homemade drugs. And I worry that this will be generally the trend, maybe even for the luxury industry. Well, I explain why. Because as China reduces its growth rate very aggressively in the first quarter, and maybe later, because retail sales will be, decelerating and investment will be very weak, etc. The only thing China can do pretty fast is to stop imports or to limit imports. So for domestic production, I'm not, I don't have a strong argument, except for the negative sentiment and people maybe not willing to buy. But for the imports, I do think it's going to be even worse, because China is, as we speak, substituting imports even more aggressively than it did in 2019. Gosh, I see so many questions. So on the side, I see tech.
Yes, there is tech. There is also a question on Trump administration. Do you think that it will take some, let's say, finance measure to help China?
I think the Trump administration wants two things. First, China to kneel and say, "Oh, only the U.S. can produce a relevant vaccine," or you know what I mean. I think that the U.S. is expecting China to kneel, because that would be extremely important for the campaign. China is not willing to kneel. So there's this when people write now, and there was a very interesting article today on the lack of international cooperation on the coronavirus as opposed to previous events. I think it is partially because we are in a Cold War. So meaning, we will say it's different than the old Cold War. I understand all that. But to make it simple, the US is wanting to collaborate only if China pleads for help. And China is not ready to do that. So it's very difficult to think of the US as offering a major package of any sort, the IMF offering a major package of any sort, because China first still wants to hold this view that it's the hegemon. The hegemon doesn't necessarily ask for help. So that or at least one of the two hegemons. So I think that doesn't bode well for cooperation in the future. Yes.
Okay.
I see more questions. Yeah, really questions.
Yes, regarding the question, there is some question about high-tech, maybe, let's say, some impact on the high-tech sectors, but also a question regarding, let's say, how tech and AI maybe could help on the coronavirus recovery. Can we, let's say, boost the economy through these technologies?
Well, of course, on paper, if there is a country that is ready to track cases, that should be China. Yeah, if we think about the amount of surveillance and the news we read or we even see in terms of controls in pharmacies to sell even painkillers or fever control measures and so on. You could argue that wow, the amount of tools that China has, AI based, to control the contagion are many more, supposedly, than anybody could have elsewhere. But the reality is that when we see what's really happening, I just wonder. I just wonder why we don't have more details on even, passengers. On, I mean, it actually seems that I mean, this to me, and this is my reading, the coronavirus is actually showing some of the key weaknesses of an oversold, sorry to say, tech dream in China. Because if it weren't, and I'm only talking about AI, I can talk about semiconductors in a moment. I just thought that we should be able to have more information. We all know that there was about 2 million people who left Hubei province, and there's still instances where people say, well, we understood that they were from Hubei from the car number. I mean, it's like, excuse me. I mean, aren't you the kings of the universe in AI? Like, there's something that I struggle to understand. It may be the size of the market. It may be that what China is trying to do has not yet been fully accomplished, and they are getting there. But the image, the impression, is not very, it's not very impressive to me. On different sectors beyond AI, such as semiconductors, I worry a lot, because when you read even, statements from Huawei recently, stuff like Foxconn, Huawei will help in the production of masks or stuff like that. Okay, and then neither of the two could start operations at the due date after the Chinese New Year, or their heavy dependence, especially for Huawei, on semiconductor imports, knowing what's happening with logistics and ports in China. So, I just frankly think that in the key sectors, China is not yet it's not yet fully independent, basically, from the value chain elsewhere, especially semiconductors, and that could be a hinder. That could hinder China's development of these key sectors in the future, because not only is the value chain going to shape differently, which is one of the questions that I see repeated on my meeting chat, in the sense that the size of China, this China-centric value chain, is going to be reduced, but also other companies' dependence on China in terms of imports, think about semiconductors, I think will shrink, because they may not want to have 80% of their clients concentrated in a single geography. So in that is bad news, actually, for China's moving up the ladder for some specific sectors, ICT and semiconductors being the most obvious one. And for AI, I think I already answered the question. I'm not saying they may not be at the frontier, but frankly speaking, I mean, we're talking about a province of 50 million people, and what we see doesn't bode well in terms of the control, in terms of the surveillance, control, information they may have on that population. That's my humble opinion. If not, you would need to lock people down in their homes if you were to know more about them. So that's all I can say.
Okay, thank you, Alicia. Maybe just one word on the supply chain, and maybe we will focus after that the last question on the Hong Kong situation. So you talk about the supply chain in China. Do you expect a reallocation of this supply chain now out of China?
Yeah, well, it's already happening. The FDI into ASEAN overall was bigger than China has been bigger than that of the FDI into China since 2017. So it is already happening. China is no longer receiving as much FDI as it used to, at least compared to ASEAN, meaning I'm not talking in absolute terms, but because China's size is bigger and bigger, in GDP terms, it's obviously true that China is receiving less FDI as a percentage of GDP, and certainly less than ASEAN. But that trend that was happening basically because of wage differentials, so wage growth in China was faster than the rest of ASEAN, and actually higher in level than countries like, say, Malaysia, which obviously wasn't the case 10 years ago. So that was the beginning of the story of offshoring or nearshoring away from China into the region. What the trade war has done is only accelerate that process. So we've seen, you know, many companies. Samsung Electronics started already in 2008 in Vietnam, and it has only accelerated. So all of this to say that the coronavirus is just one more shock accelerating the move away from China in terms of value chain. I'm not saying, let's be frank, that China will play no role, because China is a very large country with a huge domestic market. So China will still attract investment for its domestic market, but I think its role, or at least its central role in terms of production or assembling for somebody else's consumption is, I think, long overdue, and it's going to continue to shrink. This is very bad news for Chinese ports, for example, logistics, etc. So you just have to see the data for Taiwan, for Korea, South Korea, and Japan to realize that these three economies have started this process long time ago. And I think Europe will follow. And in some cases, it has already started following for some specific companies.
Okay, it's very clear. So maybe just to end the session, can we have a focus maybe, yes, on the Hong Kong economy future? Do you think that, let's say that after months of protests, is it a huge hit for HK? How Hong Kong economies can recover from the coronavirus? Is it some areas that, let's say, the future can be good or better?
Yes, I know that we want to end the call with good news. It's a pity that the last question is about Hong Kong, because it's very hard to give good news about Hong Kong. I'm going to try my best to end on a light, if not positive note. But I have to first start with the terrible news, which is that Hong Kong ended 2019 with a negative growth rate of 1.9%, so nearly 2% recession, okay? The first quarter is going to be even worse, for sure. Maybe the whole year is going to be worse than 2019. Now, the Hong Kong government, with all its wisdom, has announced a package, a fiscal package of as little as 1 percentage point of GDP. Even less than that, 25 billion Hong Kong dollar. The package is again, a sum of vouchers here and there, and no strategy, no direction, in my humble opinion. Singapore instead has announced the budget. We just got to know yesterday night, I believe. I just read it this early morning. The amount of the package is 1.3% of GDP. You may say it's quite similar. Well, the difference is that Singapore was not in recession last year. It barely made it to avoid a recession, but it was not in recession. So you see what I mean? Like Hong Kong is coming from a much worse point and is doing less than Singapore. So and not only Singapore Monetary Authority, MAS, can actually depreciate the currency, lower interest rates. Hong Kong can't, because it's stuck with the currency board. So we all know that, and therefore fiscal policy should be much more aggressive to help Hong Kong withstand the pressure of the coronavirus, let alone its own issues, which have brought Hong Kong to one of the biggest recessions in recent history. So now that's the negative. How can we play this? Well, the only positive I can think of is that, in a way, because of the coronavirus, all of the protest type related kind of idiosyncratic problems of Hong Kong get blurred into the problems of the whole China and to a large extent Asia, because one could just look at the cases and say, wow, Singapore has more cases than Hong Kong. Japan, depending on how you count them, has more cases than Hong Kong. So if you want to be pleased by the control of the number of cases, then you can end the call on a positive note. I just have to say that you know, that's great, but that is not going to help avoid a recession in Hong Kong. Why? Because Hong Kong is in a lockdown compared to Singapore. Schools are closed, Singapore schools are open. Singapore is trying very hard to attract tourism. Hong Kong is canceling meetings on a daily basis. I mean, it's just not the way for Hong Kong to grow, frankly speaking. I think Hong Kong, if I were, which I will never be, but if I were the chief executive or anybody helping the chief executive, I would actually say, wow, Hong Kong, even with 1.8 million mainlanders living here, only has the fewest cases, close to the fewest cases in Asia. I mean, you know, like just turn it to the positive. We have the best healthcare, and not only in terms of hospitals, but basically people awareness, blah, blah, blah. You can come here, it's safe. I don't see that out there, and I just don't understand why, because that message today, when people are running away, could be extremely positive for Hong Kong. And in a way, it would give this sense that, yes, we have had protests because we are an open economy. I mean, an open, I wouldn't say democracy, but an open, I mean, space with different views. But when it comes to health, we stick together. You know, that message that I don't think is so hard to figure, frankly, is not out there. So so Hong Kong gets blurred into this very bad sentiment about China, which Hong Kong does not need to be into. And that's why I hope that there is a twist in a way in the message, in the official message about Hong Kong and the coronavirus, because there are reasons to twist that message for the positive. Hong Kong cases are few, and the situation seems to me, I may be wrong, is under control. So let's switch to that message soon, which would improve confidence in Hong Kong and maybe bring more tourists, or, you know, stop canceling meetings. I don't know. I just don't understand why we're in this mode. But, you know, again, I'm nobody to say why. I may miss part of the information.
Okay, thank you, Alicia. I'm not sure that we have a positive word to finish. Maybe just the last question, because we have 5 minutes left. Do you think that this crisis can benefit to other countries in Asia, if it's not China, if it's not Hong Kong? Do you think, yes, one country who could, or maybe countries who could benefit from the crisis?
Well, again, I'm not 100% sure yet that Hong Kong may not benefit. I think Hong Kong can still turn this thing in its benefit. Maybe not for the rest of the world, but for China. I think the idea that Hong Kong is safe, which people didn't kind of think about after the protest, may come back. And I think it's coming back. Why? Because everybody can see that not only the number of cases, but the way things are organized, you know, how things are being handled. You may say that we still see, you know, all of this toilet paper stocking, and people laugh at it in the mainland, but it is irrelevant because that doesn't harm anybody. So in terms of actual harm, Hong Kong could be seen, and frankly, I think it is being seen. You just have to look at everything, yeah, from the housing, sales of house, real estate performance. Hong Kong is not collapsing. Actually, I mean, GDP is collapsing. Why? Because nobody's coming, because the retail sales, luxury, blah, 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 everything, I mean, hospitality, airlines, yes, related to that. But in terms of the actual engine, finance and housing, we don't see it yet. So what I'm trying to say is that for mainlanders, Hong Kong may appear safer than they thought it was, and China may appear less safe than they thought it was. And that is a turn, you see, in terms of Hong Kong attractiveness for mainlanders, that at the end of the day are the ones which can support the housing market, the financial sector, eventually maybe the luxury market. But again, I think the luxury shock is more of a sentiment thing, and maybe it'll be negative for a while as long as the coronavirus is in place. So Hong Kong again could turn it into the positive. Other places, I think, you know, is like as tangential as possible as you can be from the mainland. So global value chain, everybody's talking about Mexico. Why? Because Mexico is not Vietnam. Mexico hardly depends on Chinese inputs. Vietnam does. So you need to, Turkey, people are talking about Turkey. Why? Because you need to be totally, I mean, not totally, nobody is totally insulated from China, but as insulated as possible. So people are going to look out of the region or within the region, but not too dependent on China. And that's where I think these are the locations that are going to do best at the current juncture.
Yeah, very interesting to have this final word on Mexico and Turkey. Thank you, Alicia, for sharing your views. I think that we are a lot to learn a lot of things this morning. I hope that everyone has his answers as much as we can, because we know that we live some uncertain times. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you to all. And I wish you a very good day and see what happens later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time. Thank you.